Welcome, my name's Dean Sobel, and we're standing in the first gallery of the Clyfford Still Museum's new exhibition, Clyfford Still in Maryland, The Late Work. This exhibition explores the work Still made between 1961, when he moved from New York to Maryland, until his death in 1980. It spans the years from his mid-50s until age 75. A lot of his contemporaries didn't live long enough to have to battle through the creative struggles of creating work over and over again. And there's something fascinating about looking at Still's Maryland period work in conjunction with the work for which he is best known, the Abstract Expressionist period from the late 40s and 1950s. As with all artists, I think the notion of creating new ideas and new images don't always come easy, and I think that was the case for Clyfford Still as well. In 1961, he moves to Westminster, Maryland, where he created the works in this first gallery, and I feel these works represent what we're calling a new start. The works in this gallery represent a very interesting comparison to the works that he made in New York during the 1950s. As you probably know, that work was heavily encrusted, filled with forms and paint material, and of a very large scale. In contrast, the works in these galleries are rather medium scale and represent an economy of imagery. Oftentimes there's only 1, 2, or 3 painted forms on what will be his characteristic bare canvases. In many respects, I think this is the artist rather carefully and methodically looking at how he can build his pictures up again. In the painting immediately to my right, it features 2 rather simple painted forms, a relatively small black patch and a slightly larger red patch that seems to be in dialogue with the other. It investigates basic figure-ground relationships, how that form rests on the surface, how it relates to the things in its surrounding, and how we relate to it as viewers standing before it. These works are rather unusual in Still's career, and we'll see him return to more reductive forms near the end of the exhibition as well. But I think this is a wonderful starting point for us to consider how he'll develop and evolve throughout the 19 years that he was in Maryland. We're standing in the second gallery of the exhibition, which features works made mostly from the mid-1960s to the end of that same decade. And the painting I'm standing in front of, I think, is an excellent example of how Still's thought processes and style are evolving during the mid-1960s. We know that this painting began in 1963 and included essentially only the top form of red that's coming down to a point, and most of the black areas that you see, and all of that is based on a drawing from 1958 that we also have in our collection. The first state of the painting was photographed by the artist, and so we have that as a record of how this painting evolved over the next several years. As you can see from the version we have in the exhibition, Still started to add additional forms, most specifically a large black form that I feel is sort of columnar that adds a stability to the left-hand side of the painting. But then he filled in a lot of the previously bare areas with the shades of ochre that make it far less reductive and do mark, I think, a return to the more expressive, characteristic canvases that he is best known. Probably most interesting about this painting, and we start to detect this in works from the New York period, the later New York period as well, is if you look carefully on the right-hand side, both in the black and in the browns, there starts to be a clockwise swirl that breaks apart some of the more vertical, solid columnar forms that we know Still tended to prefer in the 1950s. And it's as if the whole painting is being set in motion by some kind of force, implied or conceptual in that respect. By 1966, when he finished the painting, it bears little resemblance to the initial idea that was represented in the late 1950s drawing and the first date of the painting from 1963. One of the fantastic aspects of the Clyfford Still Museum is that we have all of this related material. We have the actual drawing, we have the photographic evidence of the various steps the painting took, and a lot of that is carried forward into a little experiential aspect we've added to the exhibition, and that is a recreation of Still's painting carts, which features his tools, his paint materials, and I think gives you a sense of what a day-to-day production of his paintings look like. All of that is drawn from our extensive photographic and archival evidence, and including some additional photographs that show another painting in the exhibition, PH 432, also in an earlier state. And so again, it's the ability to ask ourselves, what was it about the painting that was guiding him to the finished state, and also what actually qualifies as being finished when there's so much bare canvas and so much more he could have done. I think that's a very constant in artist studios and in painters' minds and other artists' minds, is what does the painting need, what else can I add to it, and at what point, I think using Still's words, would you end up killing the painting? And I think both this large canvas from 1963 to 66 and then the other painting from around the same time starts to give us a view into Still's working process, something we always try to emphasize here at the museum. One other thing I think visitors will notice as they're working their way through the galleries is the new color selections and color choices that Still made in Maryland. You'll see purples and greens, some pinks. Here in the third gallery, we're looking at a group of paintings that feature a range of browns, ochres, siennas, both raw and burnt, and they have a very strong earthen quality. Additionally, some of the more characteristic forms and passages that we're used to seeing, the so-called lifeline that we always try to highlight in paintings of the abstract expressionist period, are even done in new color values. This one is more red-orange than perhaps the typical darker turkey red, we call it, that you see in the 1940s and 50s. Additionally, I think Still is starting to experiment a great deal. In some respects, I think he starts to exaggerate the things that we see in his work. Across from me, there's a painting with a lifeline that is bulging and swollen like a rivulet or river of some sort. This lifeline seems to break and much more wispy and maybe even more elegant or serpentine than some of the more strong characteristic lifelines of the earlier period. And probably what's most notable about this picture is what I call this new dynamism. Like what we saw in the previous gallery, the forms are starting to break apart and Still sets them in motion. So the activity we see from the top right of the painting, both in the black and the blue forms, are heading toward the lower left corner, where they are met by this wonderful constellation of reds and yellows and golds and oranges. And it's as if these two forces are sort of meeting in a way that is quite exaggerated, as I said. The subtlety and some of the more glacial movement that we see in Still's earlier work is really opened up to create very, very dramatic paintings. As with all creative people, I think there are moments when you have a lot of ideas and probably years or perhaps even decades when you don't have as many. And there is something that happens in the early 1970s where I think Still sort of pulls it all together. I haven't done a complete count, but probably half of the paintings in this exhibition date from 1970 to 1975. It's a very prolific period. He tries out a lot of new formats and colors colors and experiments a great deal with the solidity of the earlier work, and again, how everything is sort of set into motion. And so I think the early 1970s, which are also represented in this third gallery in the exhibition, represent almost a kind of apex of Still's creativity. He had nothing but time in Maryland. He had very little distractions from the art world or from other people. It was mostly him and his family that he was surrounding himself with. And I think you can see it in the early 1970s that he's settling in and creating some of the greatest paintings of his very, very long career. Notions of painting and process and the role of drawings comes up extensively in the exhibition, and so we'll go across the bridge into the fourth gallery where we'll look a little bit more closely at the relationship between the paintings and the works on paper. As I mentioned earlier on our walk together through the exhibition, the Maryland period was very prolific, something like 385 paintings and probably over 1,100 drawings, or works on paper as we call them. And that's actually more than half of the drawings of his entire career, spanning some 6 decades. What marks the drawings in the late period is, one, they're done almost entirely in pastel, although I'll look at an exception to that in a second. And almost all of those pastels are on various kinds of construction paper, colored construction paper that he probably would have bought at a local 5 and dime store. The role of drawings within all artists' work, but within Still's career, is very fascinating. You may know that the drawings are exceptionally rare, unlike the 150 paintings that got out into the world either by gift or purchase from collectors and museums. Virtually all of the drawings are here. So anytime that we show the drawings, we think it's pretty special. They're very sensitive to light, these color construction paperworks especially so. And so it's really quite a treat to have this many drawings out at one time. One thing that I wanted to mention is this aspect of the exhibition really tries to bring in that connection again between painting and drawing. Oftentimes we see ideas being worked out on paper first and then being amplified in the paintings. But of course we see the exact opposite as well. And over the years we've always tried to stress how the paintings aren't the major works and the drawings the preparatory studies, that for Still and many modern artists they are equally important and they inform and influence each other. If you look at this arrangement, you see almost a complete glossary of what defines the late work. Right behind me there's a pink that I've never seen in Still's body of work in the 40s or 50s or before that. You see things that are quite spare and austere. You see things that are quite frenetic and almost chaotic. And very simple thought exercises too. Just like some of the converging forces we saw in the Maryland paintings, you see it expressed in a very simple idea of just 2 pastel lines creating this very simple but very thought-provoking X pattern. One of the things that seems to be particularly related to the drawings are different qualities of line. One that I would call somewhat almost confetti-like. We think these were created either by squeezing paint, these are oil paint on poster board, paint directly from paint tubes, or perhaps he was even using his finger or a very, very small palette knife to create a different quality of line that is unlike anything we see up until the Maryland period. Another good example would be things that are more sort of furry and soft edge. This is a very unusual aspect that he then successively translates into the paintings. And so the relationship again with how pastel has its own characteristics and paint has its own still tries to find ways where those two can merge. Using this as an example, one thing that we started to notice really early in the discovery of the collection is that many of the later paintings look like drawings wrote large. And in fact, if you do a rather simple calculation of the 12 by 18-inch sheet that the construction paperworks were often made on, that's the same 2:3 ratio that a number of the paintings take for the large works in Maryland also. And so the fact that this looks like a immediate thought can be blown up to 14 or 15 feet using that same ratio, and they have even a greater relationship and a greater correlation between each other. That is not to say that sometimes we don't see familiar nods back to early aspects of his career. The orange line in this oil on poster board seems to be describing that lifeline, that almost anthropomorphic line that might express a shoulder down to an arm, thus representing some aspect of human figuration. Others are very richly painted, again in this particular oil on poster board work that seems to be a more expressionistic take. But then again we have any number of exceptions to that, and probably the takeaway from all these drawings is that the drawings are the place where you can work the ideas out quickly and methodically and go back and use them for your own purposes later, even in decades later in the case of Clyfford Still. We'll move into the 1970s paintings again in the next room, and we'll see some of what I think are the strongest paintings still made in Maryland. Well, we're in the second to the last gallery of the exhibition, and this is probably a reflection of some of my own curatorial frustration at not having more rooms to put these paintings in. As I mentioned, Still made about 380 paintings during the Maryland period, and it's a very difficult task to try to summarize what we mean by late work in just the 6 galleries that we've put the exhibition in. And so this room is mostly works from the mid-1970s, but it represents what I might call highlights of certain roads not taken, certain examples that bring back imagery from earlier in the exhibition, and in some cases just unique one-offs that I think represent very, very strong examples. As I've said about this exhibition now over the course of 2 years, the Late Works exhibition is really a proposition. It's one way of sorting through this large body of work and trying to make sense of it, hopefully draw some circles around different characteristics and qualities that are different from the abstract expressionist period. But I think it's really, really important to consider and allow for different viewpoints and interpretations and certainly different tellings of the story of the Maryland period. The painting that I'm standing in front of is one of the great paintings of the collection of any period, PH 929 from 1974. And to me, it represents what I think is probably the embodiment of a reconciliation of his earlier abstract expressionist period while filtering it through some of the new stylistic and painterly processes that characterize the late work. It's principally a black and white painting. We have a number of those in the 1940s and 50s. I think that's probably most obvious. You might not see so clearly, but there are a number of vertical lifeline elements. Here's another kind of deep red one, a yellow, somewhat arcing one just behind me, and then a strange blue horizontal line that I'll touch on in addition to the yellow and purple touches, highlights that he applies. But what is most interesting about the painting is how it represents this new, what you could describe as fluttery, feathery, activating. There is a sense of kind of an upward movement, not the arcing or the vortices that we see in some of the other paintings, but it seems to be rising rising from the bottom to the top. And by looking at that, you think of things like tinders or fires, adjectives like roaring or flame-like come into being. But it's also a very large canvas, slightly larger than the 9x13 format that we see most commonly in the 1950s. It's also a painting that we know still reworked. He filled in some of the bare and white areas at the bottom to give it that stronger foundation at the lower edge of the painting. And the scale and the relationship of these huge, enormous, flickering black forms is quite awe-inspiring, and one that I hope you will take advantage of. It's a painting that we've shown a lot, almost in every exhibition. And again, I would stand this painting up against anything he made in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. I think of it as a remarkable masterwork, if we can use that term for this particular painting. Obviously, the quality of bare canvas is quite prominent here, and as often is the case, it's quite specific when white is used as opposed to the more neutral bare. And the way Still, by this point, finds the opportunities to accentuate the differences between white and bare, all while situating them and placing them within this enormous field of black paint. Pounds of paint is what the daughters often describe when Still would attack the canvases of this scale with his palette knife. The quality of the bare canvas will be a major feature of the works in the last gallery, and one that I'm especially interested in taking you into next. We're in the last gallery of the exhibition, Clyfford Still in Maryland, the Late Works. And the works in this gallery really represent what I think marks a lot of late career artists. They seem to find ways to express their ideas in simpler, maybe more economical terms. The ideas and the characteristics of what we know and love about Clyfford Still's work are all in these paintings, but again, they seem to be expressed in the barest of means. This painting from 1977 is another example where I think it has a very close relationship to his work in pastel. The very few marks you see, and you could probably see the various yellows, the red at the bottom, but there's a great deal of white interspersed as well. And each one of those marks has a lightness and a drawing-like quality, which is a little unusual when you take the scale of my hands and realize that they're about 3 feet in width. The hushed canvas backgrounds are especially prominent in these late works. And I think they represent such a strong compositional aspect of Still's late work. The fact that so little is being put down on a canvas that's this scale represents, I think, a confidence, too, that you could walk away from a painting with so few marks and create such a powerful statement at the same time. Noticeably, something seems to be happening on the left edge. I get a sense of almost, if it was a small drawing and pigments laying on paper, that a wind has come through and moved these toward the upper edge. Another one seems to be scattering the paintings to the top edge as well. You almost get the sense that the forms, the painted forms, are moving out of our view. I've said this before, and I think it's an interesting consideration when looking at these paintings. If Still had lived longer, you almost get the sense that fewer and fewer marks would appear, and we'd be looking at essentially a bare canvas at the very end of his career, which in some of these works I think is probably the case. All the works in this gallery are from roughly 1977 to the very last year of his life. It was a very important period for Still because it was during this time that he was offered a one-person exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of New York, of Art in New York, a very high honor then and now for a living artist. The preparations are underway for that exhibition, but shortly after that invitation is given, Still realizes that a number of the digestive problems and maladies that he was experiencing were in fact due to a diagnosis that he would get in 1979 of colon cancer. The paintings start to become fewer and fewer. He only makes 4 paintings after that unfortunate diagnosis, but drawings start to become more possible. We have no paintings from 1980, but we have a few dozen pastels on paper that extend into the 1980s, making his drawings the actual last works of art that he finally made. It's a rather sad ending, but there is something to the late works that does feel like a complete circle has been made. Even within the Maryland works, those very sparse economical splotch paintings of 1963-64 seem to be present in these more expressive, perhaps lighter paintings that we see in the late 70s. But I don't think Still ever intended that he wanted his art to be a narrative or an analog to what was going on in his personal life. Like all great artists, Still was committed to making a timeless art that wasn't connected to any time or place or movement, but one that showed the strength of his character and the strength of his purpose. And I think there's no question that the Maryland work proves that point home. They are some of the most experimental, some of the most daring, but also some of the greatest paintings that he ever made. Thank you for your time with me in the galleries today. I hope you'll come and see the exhibition in person or see many of these paintings as they are rotated in and out of the galleries over the next several years. Again, I'm Dean Sobel. Thank you very much, and visit the museum often.